Students, and welcome to the first lecture for Political Science 1513, American Federal Government Online. This week we're going to get started by talking about some of the fundamental concepts, some of the whats and whys of American government and politics. And as with any other week in this semester, I want to begin by reading off some basic learning objectives that you can focus on when you're taking notes as you listen to this video. So, let's get started with our learning objectives for week 1. The learning objectives for this lecture are as follows. Number 1, explain each of the following concepts: government, politics, legitimacy, authority, and power. Number 2, discuss how the government affects you and why it matters. Number 3, identify the 3 main activities of all functioning governments. Number 4, discuss the main reasons why people accept government's coercion and authority over us. Number 5, identify and describe the key features distinguishing government from other forms of coercive institution, to include, but not limited to, organized crime syndicates. So let's begin with that first learning objective, and let's start by defining the most fundamental concept in a government course: government itself. Now, if you've kept up with your reading, and I hope that you have, you know that the textbook defines the term government as, and I follow, and I quote, "the preeminent institution within a society. Government has the ultimate authority to decide how conflicts will be resolved and how benefits and privileges will be located." Now, this is a perfectly functional, technically correct definition, but I want to simplify it for our purposes and for the purposes of exams and quizzes throughout the semester. What I want you to jot down is that government might simply be defined as the institutional setting within which politics happens. But this definition itself begs a couple questions. So first, what do I mean when I say that government is an institutional setting? Well, what I mean is that it's not a physical location, right? An institution is something that outlasts its particular members. The United States government has existed and continued to exist for a lot longer than any of the particular individuals within that government. We've gone through several presidents, over 100 different Congresses, and yet the institution itself remains the same. That's important to understand because governments allow us to have some consistency in our society. We don't have to start over and reorganize every part of society every time our leader passes away or we replace one regime with another. So governments are institutional. To participate in government does not require visiting a particular location, and governments do not deteriorate in the same way that physical structures might deteriorate as they are exposed to weather conditions over time. So government is institutional, not physical. It's also important to understand what I mean when I say that government is where politics happens. Politics is the process by which we make collective decisions about who gets what, when, where, why, and how. So I do want you to understand that politics necessarily involves a collective. If you are on your own, on a deserted island, you might have to make decisions about when you're going to eat your food and how you're going to go about doing so. But that would be a purely psychological decision because you wouldn't have to worry about factoring in the responses or the attitudes, beliefs, and capacities of any other actors. You can only practice politics when you are a part of a group, and that group must collectively make decisions about who gets what, when, where, why, or how. Do note, however, that not all collective decision-making processes are democratic. It would also be possible for a group to decide who gets what, when, where, why, and how by fighting or by seizing a weapon and using that to threaten everybody else in the group so that they do what you think is right and appropriate or what you find is in your own best interest. All of that counts as a form of politics. So politics can be democratic, it can be peaceful, it can be civic, but it can also be violent, totalitarian, or tyrannical. The bottom line is that anytime we've got a group of people who are negotiating or fighting to make decisions about who gets what, when, where, why, and how, that's politics. One final point before we move on. The what and who gets what, when, where, why, and how is not limited to tangible goods or services. Okay, so one thing that in politics we might argue about is who gets to keep how much of their paycheck, or who gets to keep how much of the economic revenue generated by a society's job market. That is negotiations, that is politicking over a tangible resource. But we're not just deciding who gets how much money, food, or water. We're also going to make decisions about who gets what rights, duties, or liberties. For example, in the United States, we have decided that men between the age of 18 and 27 have a duty to sign up for national service and, if called upon, to serve in the military upon being called through a draft. That is a duty that we have decided will apply to some portions of our population, but not to others. So when we, as a society, implemented the draft, we made a decision about who gets that particular responsibility, men between the age of 18 and 27. And it is, again, important to understand that that decision took place and was made entirely in the context of government. Who particularly passed the laws that targeted men with the draft? Our government, because government is the setting within which we as a society make these types of collective decisions. So, why should you care about government? Now that we know what it is, it's important to take a moment to talk about why it matters. Well, there are going to be a lot of reasons why you might want to know about government and politics, the most obvious of which is that you're going to need this information in order to pass this class. You're paying me for a grade, you might as well make sure that it's a good grade, and in order to do that, you've got to pay careful attention and learn all of the appropriate content, because if you don't, you're not going to have enough time to complete all of the exams. They are going to be open book, by the way, unless I say otherwise at some point in the future, but they're going to be timed, and what that means is that you need this information so that you have enough time to complete all of the questions on the exam, because if you're trying to look up the answer to every single question, you're not going to get to the end quickly enough to finish. But another and perhaps a more important reason why you should care about government and politics is that it affects literally every aspect of your life every single day, and it does so in some very, very intimate ways. The government creates rules and regulations pertaining to what can be sold to you as food or drink, what types of beverages you can afford or be able to access is going to depend on laws that the government makes with regards to what types of products can be sold, what safety standards they have to comply with, and what level of taxation is going to be placed on the purchase or sale of such products. In terms of moving, you're going to find that the government obviously affects your ability to do things like transport yourself from one residence to another. You're probably going to use government-funded roads, which were built using tax dollars, and that means that the government is playing a role in that process. But we can get even more fundamental than that. The government affects how you move in terms of how you actually maneuver your physical person. So, for example, if you decide that you're going to walk into a room, close your eyes, and wildly swing your arms, even though that room is crowded full with people's children, you're probably going to wind up in prison. Someone's going to call the cops because you're putting other people in danger based on the way that you're moving your physical body, and that's not acceptable in our society. Well, when the police get there, what happens next? Usually you comply with them, but you're probably getting arrested, and if you try to resist, well, then they will physically restrain you. You're going to wind up handcuffed, you might get tasered, and you're probably going to spend some time sitting in a jail cell where, once again, you are going to be physically restrained. So government affects not just how you move from point A to point B, but how you use your own physical person. The government affects your breathing. It creates rules and regulations about what types of things you're allowed to inhale, for example. In most states, you're not allowed to inhale the fumes of burning marijuana. And it's going to do things like regulate smog and pollutants that get into our air. The government's going to regulate your talking because it's going to create rules about the types of things you can say, when, and where. Now, In the United States, we have the freest speech of any country. We can say that with a great deal of confidence and arguably with a great deal of pride. But there are limits to that freedom of speech. So, for example, you're not allowed to call in false bomb threats. You can't walk into a crowded movie theater and start shouting fire unless there is, in fact, an actual fire. So the government makes rules about your speaking. The government also holds your fate in its hands in the most fundamental way imaginable. It can kill you. Governments all around the world execute their citizens for crimes or other reasons on a pretty regular basis. Our government in the United States does employ capital punishment. We fight wars. We, under certain circumstances, have even been known to use drone bombing operations on U.S. citizens as well as foreign nationals. So, the bottom line here is that the government has a very profound role to play in your life, whether you like that or you hate that. And because of this, it's important that you understand it. Once you understand the government, you're going to be better equipped to engage and control that government, which, once more, you're probably going to want to do if you care about things like what you eat, drink, how you move, what you breathe, your speech, and whether or not you get to live or die. The government makes decisions about all of these, and you want to be able to effectively influence those decisions, which requires some basic information. And one of the fundamental purposes of this course is to supply you with that information so that you can be an effective and informed citizen in our democracy. All right, let's keep moving on. The next thing that we need to talk about is the activities that all governments engage in. Now, I do want you to understand that this is a fairly simplified explanation of some fairly complicated concepts, but generally speaking, what you should take down in your notes is this. All functional governments fulfill three major roles. They legislate, administrate, and adjudicate. To legislate is to create the laws. To administrate is to execute and enforce those laws once they have been created. And to adjudicate is to help people interpret and resolve disputes about the law by explaining how the general principles in your legislation relate to particular circumstances. But it's also important to understand that the fact that the government is allowed to do things like make laws and then compel us to follow those laws, to legislate and then administrate, is itself a bit of a puzzle. Because if you take a moment to think about it, nobody else is really allowed to do this. Governments engage in activities that are, generally speaking, prohibited to everybody else in our society. So governments control how much money you are allowed to keep out of your daily paycheck or your weekly paycheck or your monthly paycheck. And they're going to tell you how you can make your money, how you can spend your money. They're going to tell you what you can do with your own body, what types of medicine you are allowed to take and when you are allowed to take them, what sorts of things you can eat or sell to other people for them to eat. All of these are things that the government has a role in, again, whether we like that or not. So the bottom line here is that the governments of our world are going to do a lot of things that people, usually speaking, don't tolerate. If I, as your employer, decided that I was going to take a certain portion of every paycheck you ever earned and then redistribute that to people who were in need, well, you might think that my desire to help needy people is very admirable, but you're probably not going to allow me access to your bank account. And if I try to take your money against your will, even if I'm doing so for a really good reason, you're probably going to call the cops because that's theft. So what we've discovered then is that people allow governments to do things that nobody else is allowed to do. Governments punish us. Governments lock us up. Sometimes governments kill us. But your employers can't physically harm you or physically restrain you if you disappoint them or refuse to follow their rules. Now, they can refuse to continue paying you. That's something that they're allowed to do. But if you upset an employer, you're not going to be thrown into jail for it. So why is it that we are willing to allow governments to boss us around, to punish us and exercise authority over us in ways that we would never tolerate from any other actor? Well, generally speaking, scholars tend to focus on 4 primary reasons why people want and accept government. The first reason why we might want governments with the power to do things like make rules and then enforce those rules by punishing violators is that governments can provide us with consistent rules to structure our lives. Remember what we talked about on that first slide. Governments are institutions. That means that they're not going to disappear and begin anew every time the particular person in a position of power passes away or retires from office. Governments give us some degree of consistency because unlike particular persons or physical structures, they're not going to be knocked over by an earthquake. They're not going to age into death. They're going to hang around for quite some time, at least if they've been properly designed and are properly cared for. So governments help give us consistent rules to structure our lives. They help us to know what to expect from one another when we leave our homes. I know that I can walk outside and I'm probably not going to be assaulted because if I were to be assaulted, I could call the cops, who are government employees, and they'll come and arrest the perpetrator. So the first reason why we want governments which can do things like use physical force to impose their will upon us is that will supplies us with rules so that we don't live in chaos and we know exactly what to expect from one another. The second major reason why people tend to want governments and allow those governments to exercise authority over them is that governments can, at least in theory, provide us with a neutral mediator of disputes. When you're dealing with a stranger, it's really difficult to find a mutually trusted third party who can help you to decide who is right and who is wrong, or who should have to pay for damages for who. So, for example, let's imagine that you and I were driving to work one day and the two of us got into a small fender bender. You think that it's my fault and that I should have to pay for your damages. I think that it is your fault and you should have to pay for my damages. Well, neither of us can trust the other to fairly mediate that dispute. So we need a third party who can come in and who can help us to resolve our disagreement fairly, and then who can impose the ruling in that mediated outcome upon both of us, regardless of whether or not we want to comply. In the United States, the neutral mediator approach to government is usually going to be found in the judicial branch, in our court systems. In other countries, that might not be the case, but essentially all governments help their citizens to mediate disputes by offering a neutral third party. Now, I do say that it's a theoretically neutral third party because, as we know from, say, the history of civil rights here in the United States, judges and justices are not always perfectly neutral, but at least in theory, they help us to resolve disputes with strangers by giving us a third party who doesn't have a dog in the fight, but who can make a decision about how to resolve our disputes and then enforce that decision on us. The third reason why people tend to want government is that government makes it easier to access public services that might be very difficult for us to provide on our own. Now, the classic example are the roads. We all want to drive on them, but nobody wants to pay for them. So governments come in and they compel you to pay for the roads via taxation. We want roads. We don't want to pay the costs. Government makes us pay the cost, and then we get the roads. Now, whether or not that's a good or a bad thing, I'm going to let you decide. But that is one major reason why people tend to prefer a society with a government to anarchy. And we're going to elaborate on that point moving forward in this lecture. So make sure you pay careful attention to this idea that government makes it easier to achieve certain public services that would be difficult to get if we didn't have some authority that could compel everybody to pay their fair share in the process of achieving a collective good. Finally, we've got the fourth and most fundamental reason why people want government. We want governments so that we can be protected from force and fraud. Force is basically when someone uses violence or the threat of violence to make you do something that you otherwise would not do. And fraud is when they use duplicity, lies, or trickery in order to defraud you into doing something that you otherwise would not do. An example of force might be a robber showing up at your house, pointing a gun at you and telling you that if you don't give them your wallet, they're going to shoot you. We don't want that to be a common practice in our society, so we create police forces that can help us to address these problems. An example of fraud might be an employer promising you that they're going to pay you $18 an hour for your labor building a bridge. And then, once you've completed the bridge, they try to give you $2 for 120 hours of work. Well, in that case, they defrauded you. They tricked you into building the bridge by promising you a whole bunch of money that they haven't delivered on. In our society, if that happens to you, well, then you go to the government. You file a lawsuit, which will be processed in a government court, and the decision issued is probably going to be that you've been defrauded, that you're entitled to be paid the promised wage, and guess who's going to enforce that decision? Once again, that's the government. So the first and most fundamental reason why governments exist is that people want to feel safe, and they want to be protected from force and fraud. In other words, we agree to do what government wants us to. We agree to allow governments to boss us around and to punish us if we don't comply with their wishes in order to achieve goals that would be more difficult for us to accomplish on our own. Those goals might be a sense of security, they might be roads or other public goods, it doesn't matter. Governments help us achieve goals that we as a society have, but that are difficult to get in a purely anarchical circumstance. But this raises a bit of a question. If governments are so great, and if they help us achieve these goals and accomplish these goods that we already want, why do governments need to use power over us? In other words, why is government compulsory and not voluntarily? It's helping us to achieve goals that we want to achieve, in which case, shouldn't we be willing to contribute, even if we're not being punished when we refuse to do so? Well, to answer this question, we need to think very carefully and critically about the situation. An example of why authority might be helpful that you could potentially connect with may come from the Hollywood film The Purge. Now, if you've ever seen this movie, you know that it's terrible, and if you like it, then I'm probably just going to have to fail you. But the basic premise is as follows. Once a day, every year, all laws become mere suggestions. There are no laws that are enforced, and you can choose to remain a peaceful and civilized person, or you can go around robbing and murdering. Now, if you watch the film, you would think that everybody instantly becomes a serial child murderer the moment that government falls apart, but that's probably a bit hyperbolic. I'm willing to bet that none of you listening right now would, upon discovering that all laws had become mere suggestions and that there were no consequences for violating them, would not go around murdering children. However, many of you have probably played that children's game where you ask yourself, what would I do if I were invisible for a day? And that's kind of the same idea that we're trying to explore in the Purge franchise. We want to know what people would act like if there were no consequences for negative behavior. And I'm willing to bet that a lot of you, if you were invisible, would probably steal. A lot of you might go and sock that bully who picked on you in high school right in the mouth. You might go around and play some fairly dangerous pranks on people. And you would do so, again, not because you're a bad person, but because, well, when you can get away with it, it's hard not to. So governments are there to make sure that you can't get away with things that we as a society have decided are bad behavior. And in order for governments to fulfill this function, they do in fact need to be able to use some form of violence or coercion to impose their will upon people. Because again, if you imagine a society where the laws aren't being enforced by threat of police coercion, those laws aren't particularly useful to you. They're not actually laws, they're mere suggestions. Think about a restraining order without police to back it up. Well, at that point, it becomes a parchment barrier. It's not useful. So governments need coercion in order to enforce their will so that they can help us to achieve those goals that we talked about on the preceding slides. One final point, and this harkens back to the third major reason why people accept government's authority over us. In political science, there is a concept that we call the collective action problem. A collective action problem is any problem that occurs when a group of people stand to benefit from working together towards a common goal, but fail to do so. The most common example of a collective action problem is what we call the free rider issue. The free rider issue is when some people who stand to benefit from a public good or service do not pay their fair share in covering the costs for that public good or service because they believe that others will do so regardless of whether they personally contribute. And those other individuals, not wanting to give them a free ride, then also refuse to pay their own fair share even though they otherwise would have been willing to do so. Consequently, nothing gets done. Again, the classic example of this is going to be a road. We all want to drive on roads. We all benefit from roads, but none of us wants to pay our taxes. If you didn't have to pay your taxes, can you honestly and confidently say that you would do so anyway, every single year? Or might you be tempted to try and get out of it every once in a while? I'm willing to bet that most of us would probably not pay taxes if they were purely voluntary. But again, we want to use those roads, and how does our society pay for the roads? Well, it does so using tax dollars. So the government is going to use coercion. It's going to use violence and the threat of violence to compel people to pay their taxes. If you don't pay your taxes, they're going to send someone after you. They're going to start taking your money by force, and if you resist, they're going to throw you in a jail cell. Once again, governments are coercive, and they need to be coercive in order to help us overcome collective action problems so that we can achieve certain collective goods. But, and this is a big and important but, we've now identified yet another puzzle. Because what we've just discovered is that governments are acting very, very much like other organizations that we tend to have some very negative views of, including organized crime syndicates like the mafia. So let me give you an example of the government doing all of what we've just talked about. Governments use tax dollars, which you are compelled to pay, to help fund police forces. If you didn't pay taxes, there would be no money to pay our officers, and then our officers wouldn't be around to protect you from force and fraud. Obviously, that's a problem. But again, none of us want to pay our taxes. So what we're going to find is that government forces you to pay your taxes in exchange for government protection from force. That's puzzling. It's strange. If the government decides that it's going to take some share of your money to help cover costs in feeding needy children, you're probably going to go ahead and accept that. But if I, again, as your professor, hacked into your bank account, took some portion of your money, and started redistributing it to needy children, you'd probably call the cops. And they would use men with guns to come over and punish me for what I've done. But they, again, are helping the government to do the exact same thing. So, how then are governments distinct from other forms of organized crime syndicate? Because what we do know is that organized crime syndicates do that exact same type of thing. We call it a protection racket. The mafia used to send its thugs into businesses, and it would tell those business owners, hey, if you pay us money, we will protect you, make sure that nobody breaks your stuff and steals your money. But if you don't pay us for protection, we are going to break your stuff and take your money. Same thing the government's doing with our police officers. But there are some important differences that distinguish governments from organized crime and other forms of coercive institution. And we're going to talk about each of these in turn. So first, the most fundamental and the most obvious difference between governments and organized crime groups is that, by and large, governments have a lot more power than do organized crime syndicates. Power can be defined quite simply as the ability to make others do things that they would not do without your influence. So again, power is the ability to make somebody do something they otherwise wouldn't. And governments have more of it than anyone else in our society. Governments also have a great deal of authority, whereas by and large, we don't tend to think that organized crime syndicates have any authority. So what is authority? Authority is the right to wield coercive power and to punish people who disobey you. Generally speaking, we recognize that the government does have a right to do things like tax its citizens, create laws, and punish criminals. Why? Well, that is going to depend entirely on your own personal viewpoints and where you are in the world. During the medieval era, it was generally understood that governments had the authority to wield coercive power because God had put them in charge of us. And that's not usually why we think that governments have a right to wield coercion today. Today in the United States, we think that the government gets its right to do things like tax us from the Constitution and thereby via the will of the people. Through our democratic elections, we choose to give government the right to wield coercive power, whereas organized crime syndicates aren't elected, they are not ordained by our Constitution, and therefore they do not have any moral or legal right to use coercion on other people. Of course, all of the authority in the world is totally meaningless unless people are willing to recognize it. Even if I did have a divine right to rule over you, if I was the only person who knew that, it wouldn't be very useful. And this brings us to the next major difference separating governments from other forms of coercive organization. In this case, we're talking about legitimacy. Legitimacy is popular acceptance of the right to exercise authority. In other words, governments are more legitimate than organized crime syndicates. Now, legitimacy is not binary. It is possible to have more or less legitimacy than somebody else in society. And what we're going to find is that by and large, governments have a lot of legitimacy. When a government comes and takes your money so that it can feed hungry children, we call that taxation. But if a private citizen did the exact same thing, well, that's theft. Why? Because we recognize that the government has the authority to take some of your money for public service purposes, whereas we do not recognize that your neighbor has that authority. The government is more legitimate. So to wrap all of this up, to tie it all together, the most fundamental point that you need to jot down in your notes is quite simply this. Government is distinct in that it has a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence or force as a form of power. In other words, we accept it when the government uses the violence or the threat of violence we see in our police forces and in our military because governments are understood by popular acceptance to have authority to wield power even when that power involves the use of violence to extract people's wealth or to compel their obedience. And that's going to bring us to an end in this week's lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned. Good luck on all your assessments and quizzes, and I'll see you in the next lecture.